On the 5th of October 2018 at 8:14 in the evening at Sotheby's new Bond Street auction room in London, a hammer came down on lot 67 of the postwar and contemporary art evening sale. The lot had just been sold to an anonymous European buyer on the telephone for £104,200, approximately $1.4 million at the time. 3 seconds after the hammer fell, a mechanical buzzing sound came from the frame of the painting hanging on the wall behind the auctioneer. The canvas of the painting, a sprayed stencil and spray paint image of a small girl reaching for a red heart-shaped balloon, began to descend through the bottom edge of its own frame, emerging in long vertical strips of perfectly aligned shredded paper. Within 20 seconds, roughly half the canvas had been shredded. The mechanism then stopped, leaving the painting partially shredded and dangling out of its frame in the middle of the auction room. What followed is, in my view, one of the most consequential single moments in 21st century contemporary art. Within hours, video of the shredding had spread to over 100 million views worldwide. The artist, the anonymous British street artist known only by the pseudonym Banksy, posted his own video on Instagram claiming credit and revealing that he had built the shredder into the frame a few years ago in case it was ever put up for auction. The buyer was given the option to walk away from the purchase or to honor it. She chose to honor it. Sotheby's renamed the work Love is in the Bin and issued a new authentication certificate. 3 years later, in October 2021, the same canvas, still half shredded, still dangling from its frame, was sold at Sotheby's again, this time for £18.5 million. What that price represents is the central question of this episode. Before we get to the shredder, we need to establish two pieces of context: who Banksy is and how a street artist's work ends up at Sotheby's. Banksy is the pseudonym of an artist who has, since the late 1992, produced stenciled paintings and installations on public walls in the United Kingdom and in many other countries around the world. The artist's real identity has never been publicly confirmed. The most widely cited candidate is a Bristol-born artist named Robin Gunningham, who appears in some biographical research, but who has never confirmed or denied the identification. The anonymity is itself central to the work. Banksy's art is in significant part about institutional power, about who gets to make art, who gets to declare what art is, who profits from art, who gets prosecuted for making art on someone else's wall. The artist's refusal to be identified makes it impossible for the institutional art world to control the work in the normal ways it controls artists. Banksy's signature themes, developed across several thousand identified public works over 25 years, are recognizable: anti-war imagery, anti-corporate imagery, children rendered with adult social commentary, religious figures reframed in modern contexts, animals, particularly rats, as stand-ins for marginalized human populations. The visual language is stencil-based, with heavy use of spray paint, deliberately mass reproducible. The girl with balloon image first appeared on a wall in London in 2002. It was a simple stenciled image, a small dark silhouetted girl with one hand reaching out toward a red heart-shaped balloon that was floating away from her. The image was reproduced by Banksy many times on different walls. It became, by 2014, the most widely reproduced of all his images. In 2017, Girl with Balloon was voted the United Kingdom's favorite work of art in a Samsung-sponsored radio Times poll beating works by Constable, Turner, and Hockney. The image had achieved a kind of cultural ubiquity that few works of contemporary art ever achieve. It was reproduced on tote bags, postcards, t-shirts, and prints across the country. Banksy himself issued unsigned and signed prints of the image, of which the signed edition sold at low thousands of pounds, and which traded in subsequent secondary markets at increasingly high multiples. By 2018, the artist had a substantial auction market presence. His works, many of them removed from public walls by speculative collectors, others issued as authorized prints by his pest control authentication service, regularly sold at Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips for sums in the high 6 and low 7 figures. The painting that appeared at Sotheby's in October 2018 was Girl with Balloon as a Canvas, not the original 2002 wall stencil, which had long since been painted over, but a 2006 canvas-based version that Banksy had produced. The canvas had been authenticated by Pest Control, Banksy's authentication body, It had been acquired in 2006 directly from the artist by a private collector. It had been put up for auction by that collector 12 years later. The auction lot included the frame. This is important. The painting had been delivered to Sotheby's by the consignor in an elaborate gilded period-style frame, considerably more ornate than what an artist like Banksy would normally choose for his own work. The frame had been part of the artwork as presented since the consignor had received it from the artist in 2006. The auction house specialist who handled the work had inspected the frame. They had not opened it. They had not x-rayed it. By later admission, Sotheby's standard pre-auction inspection of a contemporary work of art does not, in 2018 or now, include disassembling or x-raying the frame. Which means on the day of the auction house had no idea that the frame contained, in addition to the canvas, a battery-powered mechanical shredder. The shredder was triggered by a hidden remote control. The control had been wired into the frame in 2006, 12 years before the auction. 12 years, the artist had built a self-destruct mechanism into the frame in 2006, almost certainly anticipating that the painting would, at some future point, be sold at auction, and had then waited 12 years for the mechanism to be triggered. The mechanism, when later examined, was a series of small motorized blades mounted along the interior of the bottom of the frame, positioned so that the canvas would feed through them in vertical strips when activated. The strips were precisely the width of standard paper shredder cuts. The mechanism had been mounted with cinematic timing in mind. It was just slow enough to allow about half the canvas to be shredded before the audience reacted, just visible enough to be obvious, and just dramatic enough to leave the painting dangling from the frame in a way that made for excellent photography. After the partial shredding, the mechanism stopped halfway through, leaving the upper half of the canvas still in the frame and the lower half dangling in shredded strips. Banksy released a video the next day on Instagram titled, "The urge to destroy is also a creative urge." The video showed the mechanism being installed and tested in 2006. It quoted Picasso. It revealed, in a final shot, that the mechanism had been designed to shred the entire canvas but had jammed halfway through. The full shredding had been the intent. The half shredding had been an accident. Inside the auction room, in the moments after the canvas began descending into shreds, the reactions were not what one might expect. The room did not erupt in shock or in laughter. The auctioneer, Oliver Barker, paused for several seconds, then continued the auction. The next lot was called and bid on within minutes. The audience, a room full of art world professionals, collectors, dealers, and journalists, mostly watched in puzzled silence. The buyer of Lot 67 on the phone was told that the artwork had been modified during the sale and was given the option to withdraw the bid. The buyer, later identified as a European woman, a longtime Banksy collector, who Sotheby's described publicly only as a female European collector, decided to honor the bid. She paid the original £1.042 million and received the partially shredded painting and frame. Within 48 hours, Sotheby's had renamed the work. The original title, Girl with Balloon, was replaced with Love is in the Bin, after Banksy's own description in his Instagram post. The work was re-authenticated by Pest Control, the new authentication certificate, issued not by Sotheby's but by the artist's authentication body, described it as an entirely new work created on the 5th of October, 2018, in the auction room of Sotheby's London during the live performance of the partial destruction of the artist's painting Girl with Balloon. This last point is critical. The shredded painting was now no longer Girl with Balloon partially destroyed. It was a new work with a new title, dated the 5th of October, 2018, and authenticated under the new title. The destruction had been recategorized as creation in contemporary art market terms. This was a brilliant move. Auction houses and collectors are generally hostile to damaged works of art. A damaged Girl with Balloon would have been worth significantly less than an undamaged one. But Love is in the Bean, a brand new authenticated Banksy with an extraordinary provenance and a unique status as the first painting ever to be partially auto-destructed during a public auction, could be valued on entirely different terms. Sotheby's, the auction house, did not lose money on the transaction. Their commission was paid. The publicity value, their evening sale becoming a top trending news event globally for several days, was by their internal estimation later cited in trade press equivalent to tens of millions of dollars of marketing. Banksy, the artist, did not lose money. He had transformed a £1 million canvas into something culturally far larger. The seller of Lot 67, who had consigned the original Girl with Balloon, her name has not been publicly disclosed, received the original £1.042 million. The buyer received an art object that would 3 years later sell for 18 times what she had just paid. In the weeks following the auction, the central question that art market journalists and observers asked was, did Sotheby's know? Was the auction house complicit in the shredding event? Sotheby's, at the time and ever since, publicly maintained that they did not know. Their chairman, Alex Branzik, gave several interviews in which he expressed surprise. He said that the auction house had not been involved in installing the shredder, had not been informed in advance, and had not coordinated with the artist on any aspect of the staging. Skeptics in the art world have, for several years, doubted this. The argument for Sotheby's complicity goes roughly as follows. A serious auction house's standard procedure for a major contemporary lot includes examining the frame, particularly for damage that might affect the value of the work. A frame containing a battery-powered shredder with wiring with a remote control receiver would have been physically distinguishable from a standard frame even by visual inspection through the back. Sotheby specialists would have, in the normal course of their work, noticed something odd about the frame they did not, by their own account, notice anything odd. The counter-argument, which is, in my view, the more plausible one, is that Sotheby's was genuinely unaware. The auction house's incentive in the moment of the shredding was to preserve a sense of credibility about their own due diligence. If they had been aware, they would have had to disclose it under their own internal policies and under UK auction regulations, which would have eliminated the surprise that made the event culturally enormous. The fact that they were caught completely off guard, as visible in the surviving video of Barker's puzzled reaction at the podium, is, I think, evidence that they actually did not know. What they had been was outsmarted. Banksy had bypassed the auction house's standard inspection by hiding the mechanism inside a battery-powered system that did not interfere with the painting's appearance from the front, and that was concealed behind the canvas backing. 12 years of waiting had given the mechanism time to age into the frame without arousing suspicion. One important detail emerged in 2021, 3 years after the event. Banksy himself, in a documentary-style video posted on his social media accounts, revealed that the original plan had not been a partial shredding. The full shredder mechanism had been designed to shred the entire canvas, including the upper portion. The shredder mechanism had, however, jammed partway through, a malfunction that left the upper half of the canvas intact and the lower half in shreds. In other words, the final form of love is in the bin, with the strikingly photographable half-shredded composition. Was not deliberately designed by Banksy. It was the result of a mechanical malfunction. The work that has subsequently sold for £18 million is, in technical terms, the partial failure of the artist's original plan. In October 2021, the buyer of Love is in the Bin, the same anonymous European female collector who had purchased it in 2018, consigned it back to Sotheby's. The work was offered in a Sotheby's London Contemporary Evening Sale on the 14th of October 2021. The pre-sale estimate was £4 to £6 million. The auction lasted approximately 10 minutes. Bidding opened at £2.5 million and rose steadily. Multiple phone bidders and one in-room paddle competed. The hammer fell at £16 million with buyer's premium added. The total sale price was £185,8200. Approximately $25.4 million at the prevailing exchange rate. The buyer was, again, anonymous, taking part by telephone. In 3 years, the painting had appreciated from £1.042 million to £18.5 million, a 1,684% return, or roughly an 18-fold multiple. Annualized, this is a return of approximately 162% per year. By any conventional measure of contemporary art investment performance, this is an extraordinary return. It also reflects, in my view, the specific market logic of the art world's response to spectacle. 3 observations about that resale price. 1. The buyer was paying not for an undisturbed painting, but for an interrupted performance. The half-shredded canvas is, in cultural terms, a record of a specific event in 2018 that became a global news story. The price is in significant part a price for that story, not for the visual qualities of the canvas itself. 2. The price reflects what some commentators have called the meta-Banksy premium, the additional value that attaches to a Banksy work when the work is itself a commentary on Banksy's relationship to the art market. The shredding was, by Banksy's own description, an attempted critique of the art auction system. The fact that the auction system has now monetized that critique by selling the result for £18 million is, depending on one's perspective, either the perfect ironic completion of the critique or its complete absorption and neutralization. 3. The pricing was almost certainly partly speculative. The £18 million may not represent a sustainable valuation of Love is in the Bin, but rather the kind of one-time celebrity object premium that contemporary art markets occasionally produce. Subsequent Banksy auction results have been more modest, suggesting the $18 million was an outlier. The Banksy shredding story, in retrospect, is not really about Banksy. It is about the contemporary art market and how that market responds to disruption. Consider what Banksy was attempting to critique. The Girl with Balloon image had become, by 2018, one of the most reproduced works of contemporary art in history. Banksy himself had described his stencil works as commentary on the way that capitalism absorbs and commodifies critical art. His point was that no matter how anti-capitalist the original gesture, the market will reframe and monetize the work. He demonstrated this in the strongest possible way. He built a self-destruct mechanism into a canvas, intending to destroy the painting at the moment the auction system claimed maximum value for it. The auction system responded by renaming the destroyed work, reauthenticating it under a new title, and pricing the new work 18 times higher than the original. The market did not collapse under the critique. The market expanded to include the critique itself as a product to be sold. This is, in significant part, the story of the contemporary art market over the last 40 years. Marcel Duchamp's urinal, the ready-made that was supposed to be a critique of what counts as art, became one of the most valuable conceptual objects in 20th century art. Andy Warhol's silkscreens of commercial brand imagery, intended in part as commentary on commodity culture, became among the most expensive paintings of the post-war era. Banksy's shredded Girl with Balloon, intended as a critique of the auction system, became the most valuable Banksy. The pattern is consistent. The market is exceptionally good at absorbing the very gestures that are designed to threaten it. Every successful critical artist eventually becomes a brand whose anti-commercial work commands premium commercial prices. This is not, in itself, an argument against contemporary art, but it is an argument that we should be skeptical of artists who frame their work as subversive or anti-establishment, because the path from subversion to market commodification in the contemporary art world is increasingly short. The buyer who paid £18.5 million in 2021, whoever she or he is, now owns a partially shredded canvas hanging from a frame with a mechanical apparatus visible inside the frame and a pest control certificate identifying it as a unique performance. Based artwork created in a Sotheby's auction room in 2018. Whether the value will hold over the next 30 years is one of the more interesting questions in contemporary art collecting. Banksy works trade volatility. The auction house premium associated with this specific work could persist, or it could halve, or it could fall by 90% if Banksy's overall market deteriorates. The painting, in any case, will not be on a public museum wall anytime soon. It hangs in a private European collection. In 2019, the half-shredded painting was loaned to the Frieder Berde Museum in Baden-Baden, Germany, for a brief public exhibition. It was the first time the work had been shown publicly since the Sotheby's auction. Lines stretched around the museum. The exhibition broke attendance records for the museum's history. Since then, Love is in the Bin has been displayed publicly a handful of times at the Stadel Museum in Frankfurt in 2019, at a one-month exhibition at the Bristol Museum in 2021, in Banksy's hometown, and in occasional traveling exhibitions of contemporary art. Between exhibitions, the painting lives in private storage. The frame still contains the shredder mechanism, which has not been removed. The mechanism is presumably still functional, though its battery has by now expired. The painting, in its dual state of being both an artwork and a mechanism, sits in storage as a kind of permanent reminder of one of the more memorable single events in 21st century art history. The Banksy shredding tells us, finally, something specific about contemporary art's relationship to spectacle. A canvas that was, prior to October 2018, a moderately valuable contemporary work became, after October 2018, the second most watched live art event of the 21st century, ranking somewhere alongside the destruction of works by ISIS in the Mosul Museum, or the carved-up Pollock that surfaced in a Texas garage sale. The aesthetic question, whether the painting is more interesting now, half-shredded, than it was intact, is genuinely debatable. Both states are, in their own way, beautiful. The half-shredded version has an undeniable visual presence, the dangling strips of canvas, the elaborate gilded frame, the visible internal machinery. But the financial question is not debatable. The painting is worth, in market terms, between 15 and 18 times what it was worth before the destruction. Whether that is a story of an artist's triumph over the market, of the market's triumph over the artist, or of the two having reached a kind of monstrous codependency that neither can break out of. That is the question every contemporary art collector is, whether they know it or not, betting on